Imperialism is the extension of a nation's policy to a conquested and often oppressed country, often with force and extremely violent methods. Take note of this definition as we compare imperialism of the modern era of world history to terrorism. Terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in a nation or party's pursuit of political and economic aims. Notice how extremely similar these definitions are. In the modern era, imperialism plagued the entire world. From the very far coast of China and of the island of Japan to the end of the west coast in Africa, Europe had controlled and instigated its policies in these lands. See, before we delve into the specific examples of imperialistic terror of this era, let's compare the other eras of inhumanity caused by Europe. The abuse and oppression of people has been occurring since the beginning of European organized civilization with the 11th century feudalism. During this era, nearly 8 centuries before the modern era, lords were taking advantage of their subjects and striking fear into them for their labor and support. Using our definition of terrorism from before, feudalism does qualify as terrorism. One does not use fear and intimidation to obtain something without being a terrorist. Disregarding the classical era and post-classical era, Europe still stuck to its methods of oppression even in the modern era of world history. But merely claiming that Europe had dominated these lands offers no real evidence for the terrorism that occurred in these lands. To analyze and bring justice to this imperialism, we must look at specific examples that occurred during the modern era and shine light on these inhumane, putrid actions. The three big powers of imperialism in the modern era were Great Britain, Germany, and Belgium. Each of these nations had conquered and colonized specific lands outside of Europe and imposed harsh and inhumane techniques on their subjects. First, we start off with Britain. Britain was by far the greatest supporter of imperialism and its horrible methods. See, Britain has had a long history of exploiting its people. The colonies of Britain and America were the number one example, the primary example of this vast exploitation. This affection for the inhumanity is re-shown through the British conquest and travel to China. The British frequently exploited the Chinese in several manners. In China, the common people had an extreme attachment to opium and its addicting components. To combat the negative effects of this opium had on the Chinese population, the Chinese bureaucracy outlawed the sale and transport of this opium product. Anglo-British traders smuggled in much of this opium to sell to the Chinese populace, and when the Chinese bureaucracy caught on to the illegitimate methods of distribution of this product and suppressed these methods of trade, the British then began the Opium Wars and won the Opium War by an overwhelming victory. The terroristic methods of the British don't lie in the war itself, but rather in the treaties that occurred after the war, Using fear and their military superiority, the British forced the Chinese to make their unfair treaties that allowed the British to continue their exploitation of China through newly opened trading ports, including Shanghai and Hong Kong. Secondly, the exploitation of African colonies by Belgium is perhaps the most extreme and gruesome example of the terror caused by imperialism. Belgian imperialism was specifically limited to mid-Africa. During the European scramble for Africa, Belgium strived for the modern-day Congo. King Leopold II saw the intense riches that could occur of this nation in Africa if exploited correctly by the Belgian forces. In order to gain these riches, King Leopold II used native African peoples to harvest raw material for sale and distribution around the world. The only exception to this method was the intense violence that accompanied with King Leopold II's imperialism. Leopold used military superiority to hunt and force the Congoans into labor. If any protest occurred, thousands of Congoans were killed or tortured. Like the British, Belgium used its violence and terror to thwart these people and exploit them for European advantage, shown through the repeating chopping off of hands when the African peoples refused to form or export the rubber products that the Belgians desperately wanted in order to elevate their status in the global economy, again with zero regard to the African nation, in this case the colony of Belgium.